These photographs changed how the world understood war. This is Vietnam. History unveiled. Saigon, February 1, 1968. South Vietnamese General Nguyen Ngoc Lan carries out a field execution of a Viet Cong officer on a public street. Eddie Adams captured the moment. It won the Pulitzer Prize. 67th Combat Support Hospital. Children affected by napalm strikes receiving medical treatment. The cost of aerial warfare measured in the youngest victims. My Lai, March 16, 1968. Vietnamese civilians along a dirt road after the My Lai incident. American forces from Charlie Company entered the village that day. Up to 504 unarmed civilians did not survive. South of Da Nang, January 13, 1971. A U.S. Marine stands with Vietnamese children as their home is set alight by an Allied patrol. Communist ammunition had been found inside. Near Da Nang, Operation Mallard. A U.S. Marine transports a blindfolded woman suspected of Viet Cong involvement. Civilians and suspected combatants were often detained together. Route 1, June 8, 1972. A Vietnamese grandmother carries her injured one-year-old grandson away from Trang Bang after a misdirected strike by South Vietnamese pilots. Two photographs from the same road, the same devastating moment. Hue, 1968. The aftermath of the Tet Offensive. Civilians who did not survive the Viet Cong occupation of the city. Thousands were affected in the weeks of fighting. Da Mai Creek, south of Hue, September 19, 1969. ARVN soldiers and civilian volunteers recover the personal effects of approximately 428 victims along the creek bank. Most were professionals, clergy, and educators rounded up during the Tet Offensive and led from Phu Cam Cathedral. February 1968. Tet Offensive. A widow grieves over a plastic bag containing what was recovered of her husband, found in a mass grave of civilians near a Viet Cong position. Following an operation on a Viet Cong village, U.S. troops remove women from the area, a routine documented in field reports across the war. A South Vietnamese paratrooper questions a captured Viet Cong suspect at bayonet point. Interrogation methods during the war were rarely documented. This photograph was. A Vietnamese civilian, a weapon held to her head. The photograph does not record what happened next. Hanoi, July 5, 1967. A resident takes cover in an air raid shelter during an American bombing raid. October 1968. U.S. troops rest inside a tent. A human skull sits displayed in front of them. War changes what soldiers consider ordinary. Route 1, near Trang Bang, June 8, 1972. South Vietnamese forces follow a group of children, including 9-year-old Kim Phuc, after a strike on suspected Viet Cong positions. Photographed by Nick Oot. Near the Cambodian border, South Vietnamese troops observe a father carrying his child who did not survive the fighting against guerrilla forces. Photographed by Horst Fass. Vietnamese children pass soldiers on their way home from school. The soldiers had fallen in the conflict. The children kept walking. Near Saigon, a Vietnamese litter bearer wears a face mask during a mass casualty situation. U.S. and Vietnamese soldiers had fallen fighting Viet Cong forces nearby. Photographed by Horst Fass. 1965. A mother and her children cross a river in foot to move away from U.S. bombing in the area. Dong Xuai, survivors of a mortar strike, comfort one another. When the post was later recaptured, over 400 casualties were recorded among civilians and soldiers. Saigon, April 29, 1975. South Vietnamese civilians scale the wall of the U.S. Embassy, trying to reach the evacuation zone, the end of American departure from Vietnam. January 5, 1968. A U.S. air cavalryman assists an elderly Vietnamese woman toward a refugee camp. Her village had left her behind, bound by local custom. August 1962. Ca Mau. South Vietnamese troops from the 2nd Battalion, 36th Infantry rest aboard a U.S. Navy carrier, returning from the field. April 1975. Orphans aboard the first Operation Baby Lift flight look through the aircraft windows, bound for the United States. The war was ending below them. January 5, 1968. A group of injured U.S. Marines being transported to a helicopter evacuation zone. Cam Sa Village, August 22, 1966. A U.S. infantryman carries a distressed child away from the village following an operation near the Michelin rubber plantation. Bao Tri, west of Saigon. Women and children take cover in a muddy canal during intense Viet Cong fire. The war ended here on April 30, 1975. Da Nang, 1975. A cargo net lifts refugees from a barge onto the SS Pioneer Contender. It took 8 hours to load 6,000 people. Thiong Duc, Vietnam. A Viet Cong prisoner awaits questioning at the A-109 Special Forces Detachment. Near Kai Kai, Cambodian border, a captured suspect sits in a prisoner compound, held alongside approximately 300 others following a South Vietnamese operation. Troc Han River, February 14, 1972. Injured North Vietnamese prisoners of war are transported to an aid station following their release by South Vietnamese forces. A U.S. soldier attempts to communicate with a Vietnamese woman holding her child, two people on opposite sides of the same war. Saigon, 1968. A mother and her son during the battle for the city. She appears frightened. He appears calm. Quang Nai, 1967. A mother holds her son during a U.S. search and destroy operation. Outskirts of Saigon, a Vietnamese youth is detained by a soldier of the 9th Division. Saigon, June 11, 1963. Buddhist monk Thich Quang Duc set himself alight in protest against the persecution of Buddhists by the South Vietnamese government. Photographed. Con Son Prison, July 10, 1970. Prisoners eat inside their cell. This facility later became known for the tiger cages photographs. A search and destroy mission. A soldier uses a flamethrower to clear a structure suspected of Viet Cong use. Standard orders during this phase of the conflict. June 1962. Vietnamese Army personnel conduct questioning of a Viet Cong prisoner. Phu Dien Hai, 1967. Captain Carlisle Bastion and his unit question 3 elderly villagers on the outskirts of the settlement. Quang Nai Province, May 1967. SP4 Manuel Martinez administers a penicillin injection to a Vietnamese farmer during a medical aid operation. A young Vietnamese man raises his hands as 2 American soldiers question him. Date unrecorded. Tan Dien, January 1967. 4 prisoners captured in a Viet Cong tunnel complex wait for transfer to a prisoner of war facility. Con To, February 1973. Female Viet Cong prisoners of war cover their heads while waiting to be transported to a release point. Tai Ninh, March 1973. Prisoners held by the ARVN await helicopter transfer to a release location. A photographer questions a Vietnamese family whose home no longer stands. Date unrecorded. Xuan Vinh Refugee Camp, September 1967. SP5 Paul Hernandez examines a child's throat during a medical aid operation. Quang Ngai Province, April 1967. An armored helicopter prepares to land troops near a suspected Viet Cong position. Quang Ngai Province, January 1968. SP4 Warren Cunningham offers cigarettes to civilians found during a search and destroy operation. What was happening out of frame is not recorded. April 1975. South Vietnamese military uniforms left scattered across the road. The army was dissolving. Saigon. Vietnamese civilians board evacuation buses heading toward the U.S. Embassy. Shortly before the fall of Saigon, a South Vietnamese soldier assists an injured comrade following fighting against North Vietnamese forces. Saigon. A U.S. Marine prevents 2 Vietnamese men from entering the embassy compound. Not everyone could be evacuated. USS Hancock. A South Vietnamese helicopter pilot and his family following their evacuation from Saigon. April 29, 1975. A U.S. Marine holds back Vietnamese civilians attempting to board an evacuation bus. Edge of Saigon. Women and children move away from a compound that has caught fire behind them. Saigon. South Vietnamese civilians attempt to scale the U.S. Embassy wall. Evacuation routes were running out. Saigon, April 30, 1975. North Vietnamese soldiers sit atop their tank in front of the presidential palace. The war was over. After the fall of Saigon, people search through damaged structures for anyone who may have survived. Saigon. A U.S. Marine directs his weapon toward a South Vietnamese civilian attempting to scale the U.S. Embassy wall. Newport Bridge. A South Vietnamese soldier takes cover alongside a comrade during an assault on the bridge. Washington, D.C. Vietnam veterans returned their service medals in public protest against the war. Honors earned in combat handed back in silence. U.S. soldiers photographed with enemy combatants following a field engagement, published in Vietnam GI. The image drew widespread condemnation. Villagers affected by a Viet Cong attack are airlifted by U.S. Air Force helicopter to a safer location. Vietnamese refugees board the SS Pioneer Contender during evacuation. Thousands sought passage as the conflict drew to a close. A young refugee boy sits outside a refugee center, feet bound as a disciplinary measure for disrespecting an elder. Dong Ap Bia, May 1969, a wounded U.S. paratrooper of the 101st Airborne, is helped by 2 medics through a rainstorm following the 10-day battle for Hamburger Hill. Saigon, February 5, 1968. One city block reduced to rubble after Tet offensive fighting. Ang Quang Pagoda, used as Viet Cong headquarters, visible at the top of the frame. Saigon, April 29, 1975. Crowds attempt to scale the U.S. Embassy wall to reach the evacuation zone, the end of American involvement in Vietnam.
U.S. Embassy Compound, Saigon, January 31, 1968. Two military policemen assist a colleague injured during Tet Offensive fighting. A Viet Cong unit had held part of the compound for 6 hours. Wakefield, Massachusetts, October 29, 1967. Pro-war demonstrators rally in support of U.S. policy in Vietnam. Organized by 19-year-old Paul Christopher.
Wakefield, Massachusetts, October 29, 1967. A crowd of pro-war demonstrators rally in support of U.S. policy in Vietnam. Organized by 19-year-old Paul Christopher. Travis Air Force Base, March 17, 1973. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Sturm is greeted by his family upon returning from Vietnam as a released prisoner of war. Saigon, April 30, 1975. A North Vietnamese tank passes through the gate of the presidential palace. The war had ended. Wartime Saigon. A young Vietnamese woman offers cigarettes and company to passing American soldiers, one of many who navigated survival in a city at war. Central Vietnam, November 17, 1962. An American officer poses with Montagnard tribesmen outside a military camp. The government sought their alliance against Viet Cong forces. 1968. Lo Man Hung, South Vietnam's youngest photojournalist, captures the conflict atop a tank with his crew beside him. Mekong Delta, 1973. A 24-year-old Viet Cong fighter stands guard, widowed twice, both husbands soldiers. Photographed by Lê Minh Trung. Upper Mekong River, 1974. Women haul fishing nets, taking over work traditionally done by men. Photographed by Lê Minh Trung. Outskirts of Hanoi, September 10, 1972. Militia members examine the wreckage of a downed U.S. Navy A-7C Corsair. The pilot, Lieutenant Stephen Musselman, ejected before impact. His remains were returned in 1981.
Kamal Peninsula, 1970. Ethnic Khmer guerrilla Dan Sand Hul is carried to an improvised operating room in a mangrove swamp, a victim of American bombing. This scene was an actual medical situation, not a publicity setup. Photographed by Vo Ain Khan. Nam Khan Forest, 1972. Activists meet wearing masks to conceal their identities from one another. In case of capture, no one could identify a face they had never seen. Photographed by Vo Ain Khan. Vietnam, 1965. A soldier's helmet reads, "War is hell," in hand-lettered ink. One phrase that required no explanation. Vietnam, 1971. Two soldiers walk side by side, holding hands. A quiet moment between the fighting. An American soldier and his Vietnamese companion. Personal lives continued alongside the conflict. Bien Hoa, January 1966. A soldier sets fire to a hut used for Viet Cong rice storage, following the discovery of supplies and weapons in a nearby tunnel network.
These photographs document 20 years of conflict. The faces in them did not choose to be remembered this way. History unveiled.